Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is Genre Vision. Every week, Travis and I review and recommend horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more. And this week, it's Space Flopra Versus with Jupiter Ascending and Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets. But is that what it is? I'm just going to call it Valerian. It's Valerian.
Yep.
This was something of a request episode, we should say, from our Genre Vision sister, Danielle Ryan. Hi, Danny.
Hi, Danny.
And we're going to get to that in just a minute. But first, just quick calls to action. We wanted to thank Patreon premium subscriber Adam, who upped his pledge. Thank you so much, Adam. Especially right now, the Patreon is more important to us than ever before. So thank you so much. If you want to be a mensch like Adam, you can go to patreon.com/genrevision and become a premium subscriber for just $5 a month. You can get access to everything on the Patreon Genre Vision network, all the bonus stuff we do for all the Genre Vision shows. We've been doing weekly pre-show recordings for, I think this is week 4 or 5 of that, and they've been really fun. The last one we just did was like an hour long, talking about kind of formative albums growing up. It's been really fun, and we're going to continue to keep doing these for the foreseeable future.
Our Patreon patrons are more than just benefactors to the show. They literally keep the show going. The fact that we are still going and still able to maintain our website and maintain our hosting is entirely based on the fact that people support us on Patreon. Please go to patreon.com/genrevision. If you can't swing $5 a month, we do have a $2 a month tier where you can get all of our FinFlix premium content. So that is one way that you can make sure Genre Vision keeps going for the foreseeable future.
And we just put up the uncut episode of our new FinFlix episode on Raging Sharks, which was quite a fun time. And the final cut of that will be coming out soon. But you can already listen to the full uncut version on Patreon if you become a subscriber there. So please check it out. It really means the world to us. Okay. Space Flopper versus time. We're going to kick things off with Jupiter Ascending since it came out first. And probably because at this point, Jupiter Ascending has had more time to cement itself with a certain audience. Obviously, this is from the Wachowskis, who revolutionized science fiction with The Matrix, and are filmmakers that Travis and I both have a huge amount of admiration for and interest in. And Jupiter Ascending was a movie that neither of us saw in the theater. It was originally scheduled to be kind of a big summer blockbuster for Warner Brothers, then kind of at the last minute got moved to February, which was never a good sign.
Well, when this is coming out, rather, you and I were writing about movie news. Mm-hmm. You and I were fairly up to date with what was going on with the release schedule and box office wise and so on and so forth. And then the marketing campaign for Jupiter Ascending died shortly before it was supposed to be released. And so you and I kind of both thought this radio silence was very odd. And then shortly before the film was supposed to be released in July, the studio pulled it and announced that it would be delayed until February next year. And you and I kind of, digitally looked at each other and went, ooh.
So we didn't see it in theaters. The reviews were not kind. But over the years, I think because of the Wachowskis' involvement and because of some other things I think we'll get into, Jupiter Ascending has attained something of a minor cult following. I had seen the movie previously before we did this episode and kind of didn't have much to say or think about it. I know, Travis, this was your first viewing, and I obviously rewatched it for the episode. And upon rewatch, I think Jupiter Ascending is not a good movie.
In all honesty, it's pretty bad. And I really don't get any pleasure out of saying that, because there's part of me that thinks like there was a cut of this movie that I would have enjoyed more that would have been released in July of whatever year that was. Mm-hmm. That was a little bit more uncompromised. Part of me wants to believe, as part of this whole like delayed release narrative, that, oh, they cut the movie down into something they thought would get the best test scores, and they pushed it to February where they could kind of minimize the damage. because February was considered a dump month then. It's not so much now. Like, things have changed.
Yeah.
But what's so unfortunate about Jupiter Ascending is that this is, in a lot of ways, like another totally handsome production by the Wachowskis, and it does some things I admire a great deal. But as a whole piece of art, or even just as a product, it's wholly non-functional. It's boring, and from an art standpoint, it's probably the weakest thing that the Wachowskis have put out. You know, despite it having some elements that people can consider a little bit more fun than even, you know, something like Cloud Atlas. It's like, well, Cloud Atlas is this totally bonkers, like uncompromised thing that they were able to put out as kind of their art house film. But Jupiter Ascending is, it's pretty busted.
Well, here's I will say good things about Jupiter Ascending, and one of them is that it's not a movie without vision. There is vision here in terms of the sci-fi world that it wants to build, this hierarchy of a particular family that basically owns planets throughout the universe.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's visionary, it's ambitious. Like, these are things that aren't necessarily complimentary, but I think are true about the film. Like, yeah, there's a clear vision behind it, and also a tremendous amount of ambition.
And from a surface standpoint, I totally get why somebody would like Jupiter Ascending, because if you say the things that are in Jupiter Ascending to me, I like what you're saying, whether it's because it's big sci-fi genre stuff that interests me, or because what you're telling me sounds absolutely bonkers in a really fun way. Like, if I tell you that there is an elephant humanoid spaceship pilot in this movie, you say that to me, I'm like, how can I not like that? That sounds crazy.
There are certain things on paper that sound really interesting. Like, Eddie Redmayne is totally swinging for the fences in this totally bonkers performance.
Oh, if we're going to talk about good things, Eddie Redmayne gets so much shit for this movie, and I think he's potentially the best thing about it.
Yeah, we'll get to him eventually. But, you know, if you've never seen Jupiter Ascending, the whole story is about this...
Please, Travis, please summarize this.
Well, she's a Russian immigrant. She's technically an illegal alien in New York City, played by Mila Kunis. She came over on a container ship. She was actually born on the container ship from Russia to the United States, and she works as a housekeeper. And she hates her life. We literally we see and hear her say, "I hate my life," over this sort of montage that introduces her and talks about what her daily life is like. And it immediately kind of reeks of bullshit, because Mila Kunis just immediately looks and feels like a celebrity, and I cannot believe is a housekeeper.
I said this to you when we were watching it. I think Mila Kunis is miscast, and that's not going to be the only time that comes up in this episode. And it's not because she's a bad actress by any means.
No, absolutely not.
I like you're saying, I don't think she's visually right for the role, and unfortunately, as written, I think Jupiter just gets dragged along and expositioned at for the majority of the movie. Now, it is worth saying that this story is a Cinderella story.
Yes.
And where this goes, in which we learn that she is actually the reincarnation of this royal space figure from the Abraxas family.
Yes.
Who I know at some point I'm going to say Abraxas, so just get ready for that.
Well, there's this big conceit in the movie that you have to understand, and the movie doesn't do a particularly good job of explaining this conceit. But the huge conceit that you have to buy into is like, okay, humans were actually not of Earth. They were, you know, like sort of Prometheus says, like humans came from a genetic strain that was extraterrestrial. And so you have these sort of ruling families of the galaxy. And the one big ruling family that produces this like immortality drug is called the Abraxas family. And so there are three main royals in the Abraxas family. One is played by Eddie Redmayne. One is played by what looks like a Twilight vampire guy. And then there's this young blonde woman in prosthetics who's made to look older for reasons that will become apparent later. You know, there is a scene early on with the three of them getting together and talking about how evil they are because they harvested a planet of people to create this product. But Jupiter, you know, this character played by Mila Kunis, is a reincarnation of their mother. And they believe she's this reincarnation because she is genetically identical and visually identical to their mother. Like, eventually we see statues of who this woman was. And yeah, sure enough, it looks just like fucking Mila Kunis. So because she is this reincarnation of this space queen, she, in theory, has some sort of entitlement to the royal fortune and can rule. But the Abraxas royals are all evil shitheads and want to sort of con her into giving away her rights to ownership of Earth so that Earth can be harvested for more of this Abraxas immortality drug. Eventually, it reveals itself to kind of be a remake of The Matrix, where Earth is basically just a simulation run by aliens who are being used to sustain the lives of a ruling class. In The Matrix, humans are being used as batteries by robots. In this, humans are being used as fuel for immortality juice by alien royals.
They're basically being ground down into beauty cream.
Soylent Blue.
And don't worry, whatever the beauty cream's called, there will be 17 names for it because everything in Jupiter Ascending has 17 names.
Dude, the vocabulary in this movie is fucking crazy.
Well, it's interesting because this is a totally original, story universe that they're building, but the way that it's brought to the screen feels like it's a bad adaptation of some series of books that existed where it's like, okay, there's this enormous world that they imply and that we see pieces of, and all of this vocabulary and lingo and terminology and all this stuff. And the way that it's presented in the movie, very often it feels like, am I already kind of supposed to know this? Because with this kind of story, Jupiter's character is being dragged along and introduced to this world like the audience is. But the movie very rarely does a good job of introducing her and us, the audience, to these things in a way that feels digestible or dynamic.
Well, editorially, in the first act, the film does not establish a rhythm. Scenes with her just feel off kilter.
Well, the edit on this movie, which we will say, it's very possible that it was compromised by studio mandates in terms of like, okay, this is way too weird. We need to try and make this digestible. It contributes to like an arrhythmia of the movie as far as pacing and editing.
No, it's totally right. I mean, early we get this montage of her being a housekeeper, and we get it. Like that the economy of the information delivered there is perfectly understandable. It doesn't feel good to watch, but at least we understand that part of it. And she's part of this big Russian immigrant family. We get that. But then she starts hanging out with this blonde chick who I forget the name of. And then a bunch of aliens show up and, I don't know, kill the blonde woman or knock her out. And then Jupiter takes a photo of the gray aliens. And then the movie pretty much encounters a skip. The movie sort of skips forward in time and none of the characters seem to remember what happened. And then there's this bizarre subplot where her Russian cousin has conned her into going into a fertility clinic and selling her own eggs for money. And in order to do that, she uses a false name, who is this blonde woman we met earlier. And it's like, what the fuck is going on? I was so lost.
All right, Travis, we cannot try and
go
through this entire movie.
I'm just trying to tell you that the first act is a goddamn mess until Channing Tatum shows up and there's an incredible action scene.
Yes, well, Channing Tatum in this movie is, I'm taking a swing here. I think he's called a lycantant.
A lycantant. Basically, the whole idea is he is a splice, which means he is part human, part something else. In his case, he's part human, part dog.
And he didn't get the recode or the resell to trabulate his Barabbithal.
Blah, 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 blah. Junk. The point of this is there are other kinds of splices, like part human, part bee, which we eventually understand Sean Bean to be one of those kinds of splices. But anyway,
but he never does anything bee like.
No, the only person who does anything bee-ish in the movie is Mila Kunis, and that's her only superpower in the movie is be able to wave her arms in the fucking air, and bees will do shit.
The explanation is like, oh, bees recognize royalty, and since she's a queen, they are like cool with her. So okay, so there's so much in this movie. And so talking about good stuff, when you're talking about the action, there's an extended action sequence of Channing Tatum's, what's his name? Kane Wise?
Yes.
Kane is, I remember that, saving Jupiter from these evil aliens, and also these like Guardians of the Galaxy reject bounty hunters who have been hired by one of the by Twilight Abraxas.
They didn't even look like Guardians of the Galaxy rejects. They look like straight cosplay from something else. This movie, this movie is so unabashedly dweeby that I can't help but give it a little bit of respect for just being like, yeah, fucking go for it, girl.
Well, I don't dislike the uber nerdiness of this movie. That's actually one of the things I see why people would glom onto this about.
Yeah, it's kind of compelling.
Well, I don't know about compelling. It's just very like, yeah, this is like a lot of kind of insular fictional worlds. It is unashamed of what it is.
Sure.
Like, and we can talk about that too when we talk about intended audience, because I think it's very clear that Jupiter Ascending has all kind of the visual trappings of a standard big sci-fi epic presentation, but the perspective and the, I think, intended audience is very directly female. Like,
yeah.
Typical, and I say that like from a demographic, marketing standpoint, like, and even a creative one. It's like, this isn't trying to be a bro movie of sci-fi. This is Cinderella thrown into kind of Dune wackiness.
Yeah, and it's a story with a female lead, but she presents in a way that is not at all trafficking in the kinds of things that men or boys perceive to be cool. Namely, Jupiter is not a violent character. Like, Jupiter does not express her power through violence. So the movie doesn't judge her character or the quality of her character as like, oh, well, how good do you beat people up?
Well, there's also the Cinderella aspect comes into that. There is a lot of female wish fulfillment in this, in which it's like, oh, guess what? You're actually a secret princess or a secret queen, and you're going to get taken around to all these lavish, manners, and you're going to get to wear like at least 3 different dresses,
sure,
that are all beautiful. It's like, and I'm not saying that from a negative standpoint. It's like, yeah, I get that. Like, and the dresses are wonderful. Like,
right.
They're really, all the costuming and some of the physical production design and makeups and stuff in this movie.
It is a wish fulfillment thing where a character is suddenly told, like, you are very important.
Sure.
And you are very wanted.
Yes, I mean, that transcends any, gendering in terms of what it's trying to market to.
Sure.
But then when it's like, oh, yes, you're basically going to get to bathe in life regenerating juice that makes you look sexy again and will take off all your old person prosthetics like it does to Sister Abraxas.
But also, it gives you decisions as a character in this movie to say, like, you're the one who can make important decisions that affect how the galaxy works as an economy. These two movies share a similar setting. Like, there is a big sort of giant space, I don't know, community of like all these different alien species that have formed an economy and sort of like a police force. At one point, Jupiter gets to go there, and there is a fun bit of world building that is eerily reminiscent of what was done in the Harry Potter movies. Like, it's like Space Diagon Alley. And there's a really strange cameo from Terry Gilliam, like, of all people. I did not expect Terry Gilliam to be in this movie.
No, but I mean, they make it pretty apparent where it's like, okay, she's going through this endless bureaucracy to get her title confirmed, and eventually she drops a reference to Brazil saying 27
B stroke 6, yeah.
So that that all makes sense why they would throw him a bone. But this is all because like I say, the visual trappings, the surface trappings of Jupiter Ascending, I would say are like 80% cool.
Yeah, I mean, you and I can't deny the power of that first big action set piece where the fighter ships are in New York City and they're chasing Kane Wise around and they're wreaking all this really surprising destruction in New York City. The visual effects in that sequence are frankly stunning.
The filmmaking in terms of the editing, the flow of the action, it's all coherent, it's all propulsive, it's all exciting. It reminds you like, oh yeah, it doesn't feel like it's taking place on a green screen backlot. It feels like physical space. It reminds you that, oh yeah, the Wachowskis are extremely talented action filmmakers.
Yeah, and the sequence keeps evolving and the conflict kind of keeps shifting and goalposts keep moving. Like it's a pretty fucking cool sequence. And then they get out into space and like we said, they have to go through the sort of drudgery of, you know, getting her confirmed as a royal. And then once she's confirmed as this royal, she then has to go through all this sort of bullshit red tape of like, what does it mean to meet this other royal from the same family? And it's like, okay, well, if he proposes sort of a marriage, like what will that mean for them functionally, legally? Like what will she be entitled to? What will he be entitled to? So on and so forth. And the movie sort of gets wrapped up in all of these formalities. And it's very tough to care about.
Well, it's tough to care about also because there's no good payoffs to a lot of this. This entire stretch where it's like, oh, she's going to marry this other Abraxas guy, Twilight Abraxas, and because he wants to stop the harvesting, but really he's lying to her, so that way he'll, you know, finagle the title to Earth out of her. That wedding is then stopped, but then it's like, okay, that's over, moving on. There's no finality to that character. Like these main Abraxas characters, the sister and Twilight Abraxas, they just disappear after the movie. And I don't know if it's like we were hoping to bring them back for sequels or something, but there's the arcs that they have are so unsatisfying.
Well, I mean, she first gets to meet the female Abraxas sibling, and we see this whole thing of like her in like middle-aged prosthetics, and then she gets to be rejuvenated into a young woman. And then that's pretty much it. Like Kane Wise comes and says, all right, look, you got to let her go. And then this Abraxas royal and her umpteen guards are like, yeah, whatever. Okay, take her. And I'm just like, what? It's that easy? Like, it's that easy to just rescue Jupiter? And then they do the same bullshit with the next Abraxas guy who actually wants to marry her. You know, they interrupt the wedding in this action sequence, and they're just like, all right, well, she's rescued.
Ta-da. Well, and
what? Really? That easily?
Well, and through all this, we have Eddie Redmayne's Abraxas character, who should really be the overarching villain. He's presented at first as the one who's trying to just straight up kill Jupiter in the beginning. He's the one who's like sending these alien greys, I guess, to try and get rid of her.
Keepers.
And like I said, if most people know this movie, they know it because of probably clips of Eddie Redmayne's performance where he talks like this all the time, except when he yells. And here's the thing, it's great.
I said he sounded like a pervert who was sitting on a vibrating massage chair at a Brookstone in a mall, but didn't want to be found out that he was a pervert. So he's like trying to keep it all in. But
it just can't help but seep through those big mushy lips of his. But here's the thing, people give him so much shit because it's like, oh yeah, he only ever operates on a 1 or a 10. But he is by far the most entertaining character in the movie.
Because he's the most camp, he's the most arch. We see straight down his butt crack in the movie. So the movie's clearly got goals, and it's accomplishing them.
And again, he would be an effective villain if he had a more continued presence, or if honestly he was the only one kind of trying to finagle this stuff out of Jupiter's hands, because eventually he kidnaps her family and is holding them hostage for her to turn over her title.
This movie is all about red tape. You know, they're all held up, but they're all held up by the sort of formalities and legalities of this world. Like, oh, I can't harvest Earth unless she, you know, abdicates her title as a royal. It's like, really, motherfucker, you're gonna play by the rules?
Yeah, and it's unfortunate because, again, all of the surf, because then it's like, okay, then the space cops are going to come and stop them, and there's going to be big space battles and things, but it all feels so weightless and just, it's so unfortunate. Plus, talking about filming, we got to talk about this because this is going to come into play when we talk about Valerian. We need to talk about the lighting of Jupiter Ascending.
Too dark.
It's way too dark to really take in what are some wonderful designs in terms of spaceships and props and costumes and all this stuff. It just looks way too dark. And this is an issue that I talked about recently in a piece I wrote, where if you're going to have a big fantasy world and you create lighting that is in opposition to the tone of the world you're creating, that will create cognitive dissonance in your audience, where it's like, this seems like there's an elephant person as a pilot. That should be great. But when the lighting is super dark and it gives you a tone, an overtone of, this is serious business, you should be taking Elephant Pilot Man seriously. And those two things just, they don't mix well.
There's that. But I think, when we actually started talking about the next film, I realized the kind of difference is that both of these films are very earnest, but only one of them really has a sense of humor about what it is. And that one of them actually seems to be having fun. Jupiter Ascending doesn't seem to be having much fun at all. And it's not like it's super dour and super serious, but there's just no fun of like discovery in this movie. Like, yeah, there's a whole bunch of wacky shit in the film, but for some reason it just never equates to fun.
There's a difference between being dour and serious and taking yourself too seriously. And that's the thing, is Jupiter Ascending takes itself so seriously to a fault.
It's clear that it takes its nerdiness really seriously. Like it wants to be all in on the sort of brand of dweebiness that it clearly loves, and
which is commendable.
I admire it for that, but a good movie it does not make.
No, I mean, Gugu Mbatha Raw walks out and has these giant ears, these huge prosthetic ears on, and it's just like, that is bizarre and wacky and fun, but you wouldn't know it from the movie you're watching.
Right. You have to sort of keep in mind that, like, okay, if Gugu Mbatha Raw is going to walk out wearing a giant pair of like rodent ears, that's at least a little funny. And for whatever reason, Jupiter Ascending doesn't seem to think any of that stuff is funny at all. It just wants to present its world as like, yeah, this is a real world that these characters are inhabiting.
The one time I think it has fun with that is during that kind of bureaucracy montage where this extremely fey robot servant is taking Jupiter around and getting all the things she needs signed and bribing officials. And the movie kind of has a little silliness in it. It's like, yeah, because this is fucking silly. That
shit's pretty fun. And then there are a couple of things with Sean Bean's character. Like, he says the word beeswax as a curse. And I'm just like, God damn it. I part of me wishes like he was just a giant bee.
How is it the only bee thing we see is when he's introduced, and it's a cool little effect. He's in shadow at first, and his eyes are kind of yellow, and then when he steps out into the light, they change, into just his regular eyes. But he doesn't summon a giant cloud of bees to fight attackers. He doesn't like shoot stingers out of the palms of his hand or like throw up honey to like incapacitate somebody. Like, nothing. He's just Sean Bean.
We should also talk about, one of the biggest problems with this movie is that I couldn't understand half of the dialogue because it's literal, like, made up gibberish for the movie. It's constructed language, and there are about half of these lines that are just explaining what something is called in the fake languages that this movie had to invent. It's cuttable. It could have ended up on the cutting room floor.
Well, because a lot of it never, like, when they talk about the regenerative goo, they're like, it's called recode or recall or mimzo or rapidu or fimblegas,
gnip or whatever. God
yeah,
damn it.
They say like 4 or 5 different things that it's called, and it's like, first of all, you don't need to do that, and second of all, you really don't need to do that because it's not like it's going to come up later and be important. Nobody needs to call it ribbladu. Like, it's fine. Just say one thing.
Yeah. I mean, when you see fantasy worlds that have this much sort of vocabulary for people to get over, it's rare. I mean, Lord of the Rings does it, but for whatever reason, my brain was attuned for what Lord of the Rings did and like how it gave out information.
Well, that specific example is because Lord of the Rings looks at its language as language and poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, yeah, I don't need to know what all this means because I understand the poetry behind it.
Yeah. And I mean, and different names for things explain sort of how different cultures and languages work. But like in the sense that, you know, you're getting information about culture in Lord of the Rings, here it just feels like exposition. Like it's more related to plot. And damn, that's a drag.
It feels less like culture and more like appendices, you know, of giant definitions of things. And it's like, oh my gosh, like, do I need to write all this down? And at the end of the day, you don't, because you'll grasp the basics of what's going on without all of the gobbledygook weighing you down.
So I think the biggest problem that I have overall, just kind of getting to final notes on Jupiter Ascending, is that Jupiter as a protagonist is pretty much dragged through this story, which I find really unfortunate. You know, and she's this royal character who is designed to be sort of an audience stand-in where, you know, we're being introduced to all these sort of new elements and how this universe works. And so we're learning through her, but she doesn't get to make enough decisions. It doesn't feel like she's the one who's propelling this story forward through her decisions. And so it feels like there's a really big lack of agency from Jupiter because she's this commodity that everybody else wants. And so the story is kind of driven by the whims of every other character who wants to have her, whether it's Kane, played by Channing Tatum, whose gun literally barks when he shoots it because he's a dog man, or the other Abrasics like Twilight people.
I'm going to come back around to this when we get to the Thunderdome. So I'll remember to bring that up. But what we should switch gears to Valerian and the City of 1,000 Planets, which it should be said, you know, Jupiter Ascending, totally original sci-fi thing. This is based off of a French comic series called Valerian and Laureline, who are our two main characters played by Dane DeHaan and Cara Delevingne. And Valerian, the original comics, it should be said, were a big influence on George Lucas when he made Star Wars, particularly for the characters of Han Solo and where kind of Princess Leia would go in the later movies.
Right. Their dynamic in Empire, for instance, was particularly inspired by Valerian and Laureline.
Yes. And this is directed by Luc Besson, who we have nothing nice to say about as a human being. But Valerian and the City of 1,000 Planets, from the get-go, I think people are going to know how we feel when we get to the verses very clearly. I think the opening pre-credit sequence of Valerian is downright great.
Yeah, I mean, this opening montage presented to us over David Bowie's Space Oddity is not at all crucial to the plot of the film. I mean, you can get across the kind of idea about the City of 1,000 Planets without this montage, but it sets a really interesting tone.
It sets a tone, it sets a mood, and it builds the world in a way that is fun, that it gets that idea of fun across. It gets a sense of humor, a sense of wonder, a sense of optimism and positivity.
With a minimum of textual exposition. It's all just image. It's montage. It's image and it's music.
It's music video.
Yeah.
Like it's eventually just a sequence on this ever-growing space station of human diplomats greeting different people who are joining the space station. First, it's different countries from Earth, but then they start welcoming alien species.
Yeah. I saw 2020 over the image of this big international space station in orbit, and I just had to fucking laugh. Like, it was a bit of a sad laugh, but to see like 2020 and like all these, you know, nations shaking hands over this new international space station project, I was just like, okay.
It's like, you're not supposed to be shaking hands.
Yeah.
Don't touch hands. But no, this opening immediately also sets up what you can expect from Valerian, which is like, you're just going to see a lot of crazy, cool, colorful alien shit.
Yeah. And then this montage ends after President Rutger Hauer jettisons the big ISS into deep space. 400 years later, we get introduced to this like race of pale beach aliens on some sort of tropical planet. And this sequence is surprisingly long for being what it is. It is characters who are not movie stars, who are entirely rendered in CG and do not have a single line of dialogue in English. So the movie is sort of starting out with a kind of a ballsy sequence of saying, like, look, we're going to drop you in. And it's simple, it's understandable. You don't have to understand their English, their language to understand what's going on. If they want you to understand a line of dialogue, they'll subtitle it. Otherwise, they sort of leave you in the dark. And I think this is a really beautiful approach. And plus, all of the aliens in this film are rendered in, I don't know, it's definitely not photoreal CG, but it's really gorgeous effects. I mean, really artful design, and the rendering of it just seems to fit with the film's aesthetic in a way that I think is just awesome. I mean, really jaw-dropping stuff. Wondrous.
It's interesting because this is a movie that shows us hundreds of different alien species and costumes and stuff like that, that there is a stylistic edict throughout everything. Not saying that everything has to be similar, but the stylistic edict is, hey, this is fun. If we're going to show an alien, let's show the alien and really revel in every single bit of presence that we can get from anything that's on screen.
Yeah, and it understands when things are funny. Like, it understands the inherent silliness of its content. So, when we finally get, finished with this pale alien sequence on the beach, one of these aliens, this alien princess dies, and when she dies, she sends out this wave of blue energy. And this wave of blue energy eventually affects this guy, Valerian, who is a federal agent, 30 years after this prologue. And he is lounging on a virtual beach, which is actually inside of his own spaceship. And he's hanging out with his partner and romantic partner, Laureline.
Yeah, they're there.
They are there. Admittedly, it's a really bad intro to these characters. It drops us into a relationship that basically says, like, yeah, you're going to feel like you're on the second or third movie. Yes,
this is my biggest issue with Valerian, because the intro with all the Space Odyssey stuff and the introduction that the space station has now become a living space city called Alpha, that all introduced me to the world perfectly. Now, I don't need a proxy character like Jupiter and Jupiter Ascending for this kind of story. It's not a necessity. But the way that this drops in, it does feel like, oh, these characters have been together for some while. They have an established dynamic from the get-go. And it keeps you on the outside of their relationship. And it makes their romantic arc, in which Valerian is trying to woo Laureline and prove that he wants to be committed to her and marry her and all this stuff. It makes it feel like, did we miss an entire movie? Because we clearly did, in regards to how these two relate to each other.
Yeah, this movie is what you call a two-hander. Basically, there are two protagonists who have sort of equal treatment in the film. So Valerian and Laureline, Dane DeHaan, Cara Delevingne, neither of them get an adequate introduction as characters. The first thing that's really introduced to us is their dynamic, but we don't even get a sense of who these people are as individuals. So already it's a little off when it comes to character. It's just, it doesn't really build these people properly as individuals, and we don't understand their relationship other than, like, okay, they work together, they're in a romance, but anytime they try to build romance between these two, it's just totally fucking inert. He's talking about getting married to her, and the whole time, every time he brought up marriage, I was just like, what? Like, these two characters, there doesn't seem to be any hint of chemistry or romance. Ugh, it's very frustrating.
There's multiple problems to this. There's the writing aspect, which is like, their dynamic is immediately established. There's no real conflict between them, and the movie tries to kind of manifest that, but it never works. Also, I just think Dane DeHaan and Cara Delevingne are so miscast in this movie, because this is supposed to be swagger, Han Solo type guy, and the tough as nails, no bullshit Princess Leia type. And I like movies with both of these actors in them. I just don't think they're right for these kind of roles as written. I think that the written part of it also has problems, but even beyond that, I just think they are not right for the roles.
Yeah, on paper, based on what the characters are saying and what the movie is trying to convince us of, Valerian is supposed to be this sort of hard-ass soldier who, thinks first and asks questions later. Why would you put Dane DeHaan in that role? I just don't get it. And, he's supposed to be this like muscled, grizzled soldier, and Dane DeHaan is not that guy.
When I think of Valerian and Laureline as characters, the descriptor that comes to my mind is freewheeling. Like they're these government agents who go on these missions and stuff. But the idea is that they're kind of cowboy and cowgirl in the West, just kind of moseying along from town to town, having their adventures. I can't see Dane DeHaan or Cara Delevingne as a cowboy cowgirl moseying along in the West, kind of freewheeling. Just we're going to the next town and maybe we'll make some money and whatever. It's like they just don't have that type of...
There's not a proper mercenary sense about them, which does come from the source material. Like it's a comic book serial.
Sure.
Where these characters are placed in any number of situations that, the comics can feel free to explore. It's kind of what The Mandalorian did really well. Mm-hmm. Where there is an overarching narrative, but each episode is given to these characters to explore something smaller. This is similar in structure, but for whatever reason, the casting of Dane DeHaan and Cara Delevingne, it just doesn't really compute. And the way that these characters are characterized in the film is always sort of at conflict with their casting. It's not to say that like either of them is particularly bad in their acting. It's just like it always feels at conflict with the material as presented, in the document sense. Like this screenplay just doesn't fit them. But from an aesthetic standpoint, it's never less than dazzling.
It's a truly, I think, even with that opening sequence, which is wonderful, the big mission statement of the movie is this first mission that Valerian and Laureline go to on this place called Big Market, which is this wonderful out there sci-fi concept of this enormous marketplace that exists in another dimension. So you have to wear special goggles and gloves to be able to see and interact with that dimension. But the place that you're walking around on is just a dry desert landscape. And when we see Big Market and we get this wonderful guide character who's, leading a group of tourists in, which is a great way to tell the audience, right, here's how this all works. This is this goofy idea.
It's a good device for exposition. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then we get to see, it's like, okay, I get it. This just wants to be an enormous gonzo, colorful explosion of art. Of, the best things about these kind of comic book sci-fi stuff, like from, Heavy Metal and Mobius and things like that, were that they were just kind of excuses to gawk at beautiful landscapes and worlds. And that is clearly Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets' desire. It's like, I just want to do this.
Well, and it's its strong suit too. It's not like it's trying to execute this and failing. Like, no, it's really executing this sort of wondrous sci-fi location stuff really, really well. The structure of the movie is so odd. As a two-hander, Valerian is carrying the movie as the protagonist up into a certain point where he crashes his ship trying to chase what we think is the enemy of the story. And then Laureline goes on this sort of big quest to find him, and that drives the movie for a while. And eventually the two of them meet up, but, not before going through like a big underwater district and meeting a submarine pilot named Bob. And like all of this is aesthetically pretty fucking pleasing. I mean, that's always been Luc Besson's strong point, is creating, interesting looking films. Fifth Element is legendary in terms of creating a wacky sci-fi world.
And this is certainly, I mean, Fifth Element was pulling from the same influences that he directly is adapting in Valerian.
Yeah, well, there are even aliens in the opening sequence that look like the Mondo Shewan from Fifth Element.
Right. So this is all good, but then we start talking about structure, and this is where I think Valerian really drops the ball, is that after a point, we have this main plot about this race of aliens, that their planet was destroyed and something's going on with them. They're popping up. Are they good? Are they bad? What's going on? But then the big middle stretch of the movie kind of turns into just 2 or 3 misadventures that aren't really connected with the overarching plot. It's just Valerian goes missing into this kind of zone where they can't track him inside of Alpha. So Laureline's got to go and find him. So she's got to go through all this rigmarole with a submarine, and she's got to, get a bongo to escape from Boss Nass or whatever.
There's always a bigger fish, man.
Yep. And find him. But then upon finding him, they get captured by a weird kind of tribal race of aliens. They capture Laureline, so now Valerian's got to try and has to save her and rescue her.
He's got to pursue her through this red light district. And the red light district is gorgeous, but all of this sort of episodic storytelling in the middle of this film gives you the sense that's like, man, I can't shake the feeling that the characters are exploring and doing a bunch of stuff, but is the movie going anywhere? It feels like the answer is always no.
It's so clear that the interest is that it just wants to hop around to these different locales where it can just, again, they're gorgeous. The costumes and production design, whatever the reported budget on this is bullshit, because they spent way too much money on this movie.
Motherfucking Ethan Hawke shows up looking like a touring member of Power Man 5000.
It's wonderful. Rihanna has a delightful dance sequence where she is this thing called a glamopod that she can, shape shift into anything that she wants, and Valerian's gonna basically hide inside of her to shape shift into this alien race, and the whole alien race buffet thing, like all of this stuff texturally is delightful.
Yeah.
Narratively, it's balls.
Yeah, in terms of creating a plot that propels the movie forward, total failure. But whenever I thought this movie was going to totally lose me, it did something really cool. Or it did something really funny. Like, the movie has a fun sense of sort of rhythmic humor. Like I told you at one point, there's this moment where Cara Delevingne is captured by this race of idiot aliens, and they put this giant hat on her, and the hat is a really funny image. It's like, well, this movie might not be going anywhere important, but it sure is a funny hat. And then this big alien passes out after a fight, and as it falls backwards, it goes, ooh, just because it made a funny sound. I was like, okay, all right, the movie hasn't totally lost me.
The movie knows that this shit's goofy.
Yes.
It knows that all of this crazy sci-fi stuff is silly, and that's okay. It's okay to be that and embrace it. And that's where I find a lot of direct competition to Jupiter Ascending, where it's Jupiter Ascending, like I said, it takes all of its alien stuff incredibly seriously to the point where it's this never feels fun. But Valerian is yeah, let's give Cara Delevingne a giant hat that is then revealed to just be a giant dish for the alien king, who's going to eat the top of her head, her brains. He squeezes a giant lemon over it. It's this is cartoonish as fuck, and I'm here for it.
Yeah, it's like the natural evolution of Jabba the Hutt's frog bong.
Right. Well, and I just like that idea of this is big and silly and cartoonish, and reality be damned, it's a fun and funny idea. And while the movie is narratively a slog and a drag for the majority of its running time, visually and conceptually, like you said, it continues to do fun or wacky or funny things
consistently. And then while it's doing those things, it is never not visually dazzling. I mean, the only thing I can think of that's kind of visually boring in the movie is also narratively boring. It's all these military characters that the story keeps cutting back to push the plot forward. Mm-hmm. They're explaining, so-and-so is in this district, and, we're waiting on this information from so-and-so, and, oh, this file is locked, because of so-and-so's clearance and all this sort of stuff. It's all plot mechanics, and those characters are just who is this rando?
Not only is that, it's like you said, it's just visually, it's too familiar as far as what we've seen in sci-fi filmmaking before. It's a bunch of hollow screens, and there's nothing interesting except for the personal guard of Clive Owen, who are these giant black robots that look like they jumped. They jumped out of Hideo Kojima's Zone of the Enders game.
They're so cool.
They're ridiculously cool and practical.
I mean, for the most part, they're CG.
There are no. I thought they were like guys in suits.
No, they move in ways that guys in suits cannot.
I thought there's a couple shots where they're like actual. It's like they built that suit.
Maybe, but I can tell you this: like you said, the budget on this movie is, I guarantee you, far exceeding what they published. Because the visual effects in this movie are just nothing short of astonishing all the time, and even when they're not photoreal, they're still inspiring. They inspire the imagination. Like even when they're being goofy, they're fun. Like there's this shot later on in the movie where we come back to the beachy, pale aliens, and one of them walks out of a giant shell that looks, well, shall we say, very feminine.
Very Georgia O'Keeffe.
It's still inspiring to the imagination. Like this kind of imagery is like, oh wow, this is striking. I don't often see things like this. You know, even when we're being presented big, high budget space operas like Jupiter Ascending, and it's presenting to us some rather bold imagery, like dragon people. There's a rat man, like a pale-faced rat man. There are these gray aliens. There's a dog dude, you know, built out of prosthetics, and he has like floating roller blades and things like that. For whatever reason, the design of those things doesn't quite achieve the level of imagination and what I saw in Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets from a design standpoint, like felt special. I was like, I haven't seen anything like this in a long time. And it really was awesome.
It's awe-inspiring.
Yeah.
And the filmmaking is there to complement it, I think, a lot in Valerian. It's very measured. This is so clearly a director's cut, which in that regard, I feel unfair putting it up against Jupiter Ascending, because Jupiter Ascending can't help but feel compromised as a piece of filmmaking.
Clearly. I mean, Jupiter Ascending reads as a film that they delayed from July to February of the next year, specifically so they could at least try to get the film's test scores higher. And it seems like a lost cause. You know, it's unfortunate. I love the Wachowskis. They made the fucking Matrix. But when you're comparing these two space floperas, there's clearly one of these films that feels sort of a less compromised vision, and frankly, a more dazzling one in every single frame of the film, and that's Valerian.
Yeah, I agree pretty much 100% with what you said. Valerian, here's what's interesting. I think Valerian's actually an emptier experience, but that's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It just knows that it can be a little empty, like, because it just wants to go down these different alleyways of like, yeah, now let's go do this cool thing, because that's all we're really interested in.
Sure. I mean, you know, Jupiter is full of class commentary. It's not a shallow film.
No, it is richly thematic, like everything the Wachowskis have done. Whereas Valerian, it's like, it has a very small and cliched attempt at, you know, just like, oh yeah, war is bad and is, you know, been very bad to native peoples and stuff like that. But that feels so kind of shoehorned or tacked on at the end of it all that it's like, no, what Valerian really cares about is like, yeah, let's have Ethan Hawke show up and put him in a funny costume.
I have to interject here. Drew just sent me a screenshot to try and prove that the things on set were practical.
That's what it says.
The K-Tron Warrior. Damn, that's a fun name.
It's fucking great design.
I'm willing to bet they had practical ones on set, at least for reference, but I'm willing to bet most of what we see from these K-Tron Warriors is CG.
When they're moving around and shooting and stuff, but
sure.
When I think they're stationary, they have these things.
Maybe.
Because there was a couple close-up shots where I'm like, that's a real fucking thing.
They look awesome. I can't fucking argue that they just look awesome.
And that's when it comes back around to it, it's like I feel that kind of like the simplicity of Valerian gives it the edge, whereas Jupiter Ascending wants to really feel complex, and that's more ambitious on paper, but I just don't think the narrative is there to support the complexity. So even though the narrative isn't there to support Valerian, it wins because it's also just kind of its intentions are thinner.
And it's almost always more fun. Like Jupiter Ascending rarely approaches anything resembling fun. It's only in a couple sequences that film comes alive, Whereas Valerian, even though it doesn't have a lot of narrative push, like it feels like it's dawdling, it's still having fun in some way, almost always, in every shot. I got to go with Valerian.
I go with Valerian too. I admit that we're not, I think, the intended audience for Jupiter Ascending.
Agreed.
There are things in Jupiter Ascending worth heralding, and I hope we did. But Valerian is, I don't know, it's just fun. Like, it's a really, really fun movie. It's also, you know, it's as weighty as a cloud. But that's okay.
This cloud's got a lot of water in him, Drew.
Well,
it's a cotton candy experience.
Which is fine because it knows it.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's the most important thing. While the characters don't work as an arc, I don't even know if the movie cares about them as much as it cares about everything else. So
it's true. Yeah, it seems to be that there is a lot more time spent on designing a dazzling effects film that there was on designing an effective narrative from a character standpoint. But I can't knock it as a dazzling effects experience. Like, I was dazzled. The effects knocked me on my ass. I had fun.
Well, let's head over to the shelf where we pick some movies that might act as a good pairing or substitute for our main topics. And we want to encourage you, loyal listener, to go to genrevision.com, comment on the post for this episode with your own shelf picks, and we will feature them in next week's episode. Travis, what's your shelf pick for Jupiter Ascending versus Valerian and the City of 1,000 Planets?
When I was watching Valerian and the City of 1,000 Planets, I had a big feeling of this has troll market energy. And when I say troll market, I'm talking about Hellboy 2, The Golden Army.
Yeah, baby.
Which has the troll market sequence, which is heralded as like one of the better sequences of that movie just from a world building standpoint. The troll market rocks. I mean, it's not my favorite sequence from Hellboy 2. But it's a great sequence from Hellboy 2.
I mean, beyond world building, it is simply an excuse to freeze frame everything and look at, like, my God, look at all of this that's going on. Look at every effect, every costume, every makeup. It is just a smorgasbord, which I certainly agree is that same energy is there in Valerian. Sure.
I mean, that sort of red light district sequence of Valerian, I feel like the best Blade Runner and Hellboy 2 mashup that we could have ever hoped for. It really is delightful in that same exact way that it is allowing you to discover a world that, while it takes itself seriously, it also understands that it's there to entertain you. The discovery of Hellboy 2's grander world, I felt, was really important to expand the kind of story that Del Toro was trying to tell with his Hellboy films. Where that first one was sort of wrapped up in the whole idea of like Lovecraftian, god monsters and Nazis and, Rasputin and all these sort of things that we were familiar with. Hellboy 2 wanted to introduce us to fairy lore, which is kind of largely untapped in the sort of broier sides of action and genre cinema. And I feel like the troll market was an exceptional way of bringing us into that world.
Can't disagree with that. I mean, and Hellboy 2, I mean, I know a lot of people adore that movie. I really, really like it. It's a movie I wish I could get over to totally loving because it's very good. I think that's a nice middle ground kind of movie between Jupiter Ascending and Valerian's separate goals.
Mm-hmm. All right, so what are you pulling off the shelf?
Well, I wanted to pick what I think is another space flopera and has deservedly earned a cult following over the years and is certainly would not have gotten made if not for the success of Star Wars. I'm talking Flash Gordon, baby, directed by Mike Hodges. This movie is a delight, and I should mention, that recently Max von Sydow passed away. He plays Ming the Merciless in this. It's Max von Sydow. He's one of the greatest actors who ever lived, and he kills it in this movie. He's not the only great thing about this. This movie understands its pulp and serial inspirations in a way that I think Valerian did as well, in a modern way, in a modern adaptation sense. This is to the point where there are sequences in Flash Gordon that don't care that oh, this is a giant model that you're looking at of a landscape, because it harkens back to those original serials that had that same visual look. There's such an absolute fun spirit to the movie. It has kind of an episodic structure as well, in Valerian, where it's like, okay, Flash has got to go to these different planets and stuff and peoples and have adventures with them, and then rally them all together to defeat Ming the Merciless. And it's just such an absolute blast of a film. We didn't really talk about the music in either of these movies because it's fine. It's not bad.
It's fine. Michael Giacchino and
Desplat.
Alexandre Desplat. Sorry, once you've had a few whiskeys, that name gets much harder. Both fine scores.
They're fine, but they ain't got nothing on Queen writing songs for your movie.
And if you've seen Highlander, you know what we're talking about.
Yes, go listen to our Highlander episode. When Queen writes songs for your movie just instantly got better.
One vision.
So yeah, Flash Gordon, I got to see this. I'd seen it before, but I got to see it at the New Beverly, and it was just a wonderful experience. Like, yeah, we're not ever going to get movies like this anymore. And then something like Valerian comes out, and of course it doesn't do well because it's like, yeah, I think pop culturally we've kind of moved past this. We don't want to take these things as super silly and fun anymore. They have to be serious business because it's Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
And the best things about Star Wars to me have often been the silly, goofier, outrageous aliens and worlds and designs and stuff.
Jabba's palace, man.
It's beautiful. And it's certainly, there have been moments of that in these new Star Wars movies, and Canto Bight, or Solo has a character called Therm Scissor Punch, who's, he's just in the background, but it's like, yeah, it's just a big lobster guy.
Sure. Or like Lady, what's her name? The big worm lady in Solo
right.
At the beginning. It's like, okay, that's fun.
That's the kind of stuff. But the tone of these things has trended so hard to being, you have to take this super serious because it's the most serious IP of all time. When the stuff that Star Wars was basing itself off of, which was Flash Gordon and things like the Valerian and Laureline comics, understood the inherent silliness in themselves and ran with it and had fun with it. So the Mike Hodges Flash Gordon, super recommend. It's not a great overall movie, but it's a wonderfully fun sci-fi adventure experience. But we do have to move on to our listener shelf picks for last week's episode on At Midnight, I'll Take Your Soul. And we had some good, a very fun kind of jokey thread in the comments that I appreciated from everybody. I like seeing you guys have fun. We had loyal listener Eric Fuchs. His shelf pick was Flesh for Frankenstein, also called Andy Warhol's Frankenstein. This is the infamous Udo Kier movie as Frankenstein, who's trying to get his male and female creatures to bang without much success, often while his young children are sneaking looks in. He has a very twisted fetish where he shoves his hand inside the female, but through her staples in her torso, feeling around her organs. It's truly a fucked up, horny horror movie. I know of this movie only from infamy. I don't think I would enjoy sitting down and watching it.
I don't think so either. And whenever somebody talks about this film, all it makes me want to watch is the Hammer Frankenstein stuff.
Well, which is good
with Peter Cushing.
There's some good movies in there. There's some crap movies too, but there's some good. Like that first one. I think that's The Revenge of Frankenstein. I can't remember, but the first one's really good. No, I think it's Curse of Frankenstein. Curse of Frankenstein's the first one.
I think you're right.
Loyal listener JT's shelf pick was I Drink Your Blood, for no real reason aside from shared low-budget roots and titles that announce their intentions, even if it's not entirely true in Blood's case. Fun, grimy movie, though. This is another one I've never seen, but I know it was like infamously double featured with another movie called I Eat Your Skin.
Damn.
Which is how I drink your blood, I eat your skin. It's like, oh, okay.
I haven't seen either.
No, I've not either. I just know them as like this kind of kooky double feature poster of that. It's like, oh, I drink your blood, I eat your skin. And finally, Mr. Milksteak's recommendation is a Mexican science fiction thriller called The Incident, written and directed by Isaac Esbon. This involves two different groups of people trapped in separate locations, a repeating stretch of road and an endless staircase. Highly inventive and deeply unnerving. I can honestly say that this movie continues to mess with my head. I have never heard of this.
Neither have I, but it reminds me, oddly enough, of a short story that I read by Richard Chismar, which I can't quite remember the name of, but it's the story of somebody trapped in an infinitely looping staircase in a lighthouse.
Okay, I like that. I mean, the repeating stretch of road makes me think of the film Dead End with Lin Shaye and Ray Wise. It's not a bad little kind of Twilight Zone-y horror movie.
Okay.
So thank you guys. These are all like, it's like, oh, you all came with shelf picks that we haven't seen before. I love that. It's more stuff to kind of sink our teeth into. So thank you so much. We love doing these shelf picks. Let's do some currently consuming.
Nom, 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 nom.
Travis, what's been on your plate?
One thing I'm going to talk about this week, and that is the new novel from author Grady Hendrix. You might know him as the author of My Best Friend's Exorcism, Horror Store, and Paperbacks from Hell. His new novel is called The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, and it is not a sequel or a pseudo-sequel to My Best Friend's Exorcism, but it does take place in a similar time frame and in the same neighborhood as My Best Friend's Exorcism. So similar locations are mentioned, and it does share some locations in a little bit, but it's certainly not a sequel, and it is not focused on building some sort of larger canon or interlinking the stories. It's really about telling its own story. As the title suggests, it is a vampire story. Listening to the first half of this book kind of makes you think like, oh, okay, it's sort of a riff on Fright Night and it's going to be familiar. And then halfway through the book, the rug is pulled out from under you and you think, oh, they're going someplace with this that I didn't think they would. It actually reveals itself to be a much heavier novel than originally anticipated because it gets into the psychology of the characters and why they're doing certain things and why they're allowing other characters to do certain things. It is rather well written, and its vampire monster is traditional in ways that make sense for the kind of vampire story it is. Like I said, it's kind of a Fright Night story, but goddamn if I wasn't impressed by how Grady Hendrix took that idea and shifted it to make it have a whole lot more impact and a whole lot more commentary. I mean, My Best Friend's Exorcism maybe has a little bit of commentary or maybe sort of some observational stuff going on in it. But the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires is much more rich with commentary. It is definitely a class, race, and sex commentary because the whole vampire metaphor plays into all of that. I highly recommend it. I don't know if it's my favorite Grady Hendrix novel. I still think My Best Friend's Exorcism is damn near perfect for what it tries to be, but this is more complicated. It's a tougher thing to chew. It's more fibrous because it has that commentary. It's brand new. I recommend that if you like horror fiction, you should read it.
Yeah, I've read My Best Friend's Exorcism at your recommendation and adored it and need to reread it. And Paperbacks from Hell. I haven't read his other books. I have Horror Store, but I picked it up and just didn't really give it the time it deserved. And I haven't read anything of We Sold Our Souls. But this one I've heard very good things about, and something that you didn't mention that you said to me was that it's surprisingly nasty.
It is, yeah. The vampire in this, while it is traditional in a lot of ways, the vampire itself has been shifted and changed into a form that I've not quite seen before. It's not terribly reverent of, I guess, what is established vampire canon. It's not a very romantic character, although it is a very charming character. But the reality of what this vampire is and what this vampire does is exceptionally nasty.
All right. Well, I'll have to add it to my ever-growing reading list that I am voraciously devouring. Well, on my plate, really quick, I watched a Russian film from a debut director, Kirill Sokolov. This is Why Don't You Just Die? I put my review of it up on genrevision.com, so if you want to see my thoughts about that, go check it out. It's going to be hitting VOD on April 20th, so the day after this episode comes up. It's fun. I would recommend it. Like I said, go read my review. I'm going to talk a little bit about a movie that I've been meaning to see for years. This is Body Parts, directed by Eric Red, starring my man, Jeff Fahey. this is a very nifty little twist on a kind of tried and true horror story, which has been done in stuff like The Hands of Orlok. In this, Jeff Fahey is a college professor who is in a car accident. He loses his right arm, and they transplant another arm onto him. Well, it turns out that the donor of that arm was a multiple murderer criminal on death row.
Oh, you hate to hear it.
And it's always, that's how it always turns out. And he's starting to have weird nightmares and visions of murdering police officers and women. And the arm starts to act out on its own a little bit. And I was like, okay, well, I've seen this story before in other ways. Eric Red, of the films that I've seen of him, he's clearly a student of Hitchcock. He loves the kind of tension that is able to build. And this is probably his slowest burn movie that I've seen, because it's not going for the gonzo stuff right away. It really saves it for the third act. It's all kind of this tension, and Jeff Fahey being like, because the movie is also positioning itself as like, is he just kind of going crazy? Because he's a professor who's like talking about violence in society and where does violence come from? Like what are violent acts that we're okay with and we're not okay with, and yada, yada. And when he finds out that this arm is from a multiple murderer, that's when it starts kind of doing stuff that he's not expecting. He's like, is it me? Am I going crazy and projecting this onto this arm? And then he finds out that other parts of this person were donated to other accident victims. And so he goes and searches them out. The story takes a shift there, and I won't spoil it because I recommend watching this. Eric Red, he's a good director, like really solid.
I've admired his stylistic talents for a long time. It was interesting hearing him do the commentary that he did for Bad Moon. He did a brand new commentary when Scream Factory did that Blu-ray, and he lets loose.
I'm sure he's cantankerous. I mean, I've seen a lot of the stuff that he's written. Like he wrote the Catherine Bigelow film Blue Steel, which I've talked about at one point in the show, and I recommend.
I still need to see that.
Yeah, well, it's one of those movies that I would argue, it's like, this is a horror movie that nobody's going to say is a horror movie, but this is a horror movie. Mm-hmm. And I like his complete commitment to genre. I don't know. Obviously, this movie has kind of been, I wouldn't even say it has a cult following, but it's a solid little thriller that goes to, and when it, and you know, I don't want to spoil anything, but don't worry, things will get gonzo and crazy, like you would expect from an Eric Red story. So I recommend it. It's a solid little flick, but I would say it's like, know that it's kind of a slow burn going in. It's going to take its time. But you get, you know, Jeff Fahey and Brad Dourif in a movie together. They share multiple scenes together. How can that not be a great thing?
Can't knock that.
But let's close things out with our
Comment of the Week.
And again, you guys had that wonderful jokey thread in the comments, which I loved. But I did pose to everybody and ask if they remembered or if they had even known about the pair of dice in the Millennium Falcon that have shown up in these recent Star Wars movies. And we got responses from pretty much everybody who commented last week. Eric Fuchs, Mr. Milksteak, and specifically DT Grizzler, who said, despite knowing who Porkins, Lobot, Bosk, and Salacious Crumb are, I never knew about the dice. So I feel very vindicated about these dice.
Yeah, me too. I really had no fucking clue that they were a thing or important until the new Disney Star Wars movies tried to say that they were. So, I mean, all I got to say to that is D1Awunga, you know, Jabba Nobata.
So thank you, everybody, for making sure that we weren't alone in this. Thank you very much. But next week, we're going to go back to some John Waters, because we had such a fun time with Serial Mom when we did Scary Parents or Scarence Month.
I feel like I'm about to take a dip in some relaxing waters.
Yes, well, we'll find out. This is a film that Travis and I both have not seen. We're going to do John Waters' Polyester next week.
Which is now in the Criterion Collection.
Well, you know, he's an important filmmaker, and one I support. So I'm glad to see that, and I'm glad we'll get an assuredly great new transfer of the film from Criterion. And we're going to be doing, it's a kind of wacky John Waters comedy next week, so we'll hope you come back for that. I'm very excited for this. It's new John Waters to me. So we'll be back next week with that. As always, want to thank you so much for listening. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And we'll see you next week.
Right here on Genre Vision.